This is the first video in a new series on political philosophy. I want to begin with the origins of political philosophy amongst the ancient Greeks and the Romans before moving on to look at medieval and then finally modern political philosophy. We begin now with the three-part video on Socrates' role in the foundations of political philosophy. By convention, Plato is often taken to be the founder of political philosophy, and scholars point to his Republic and Laws, his two longest works, as the founding documents of political philosophy. But sometimes Aristotle, Plato's great protege, is cited as its founder. However, in the ancient world, it was Socrates who was looked to as the founder of political philosophy. These are the famous words of the great Roman jurist Cicero, writing some 3.5 centuries later in his book Textual Disputations. Quote, Socrates was the first who brought down philosophy from the heavens, placed it in cities, introduced it into families, and obliged it to examine into life and morals, and good and evil. End quote. Cicero's words reflect the traditional division within philosophy, whereby ethics is a subdivision of politics. Ethics is concerned with the individual good, but politics is concerned with the common good, and Socrates is responsible for laying the foundation to both as objects of philosophical inquiry. In his Nicomachean Ethics, Aristotle says this about the relationship between ethics and politics. Quote, even if the good is the same for an individual and for a city, that of a city is evidently a greater and at any rate a more complete good to acquire and preserve. For while it should content us to acquire and preserve this for an individual alone, it is nobler and more divine to do so for a nation and city. And so our method of inquiry seeks the good of these things, since it is a sort of politics. End quote. Politics is a nobler science than ethics because it deals with the good of the whole, while the latter deals with the good of a part, the individual good. One who practices politics correctly seeks the common good and not just the individual good. However, pursuit of the individual good is a necessary condition for achieving the greater good. That's to say, a good polity can only be founded and maintained by those who cultivate the virtues, namely practical wisdom, justice, fortitude, and temperance, known more properly as the cardinal virtues. A good polity cannot be composed of bad parts, that's to say, vicious individuals. Echoing Cicero, it is certain that Socrates was the first to inquire about both ethical and political matters, and following Aristotle, Socrates clearly linked the two, the individual good and the common good, as we see, for example, in this passage from the Apology. Quote, I went instead to each person individually, where I was going to confer the greatest benefit possible, as I declare, by trying to persuade each of you to care first and foremost for himself rather than anything that belongs to himself, so that he might be as good and as wise as possible, to care for the city herself before anything that belongs to the city, and to care for everything else in like manner. End quote. This is not to say that prior to Socrates there was no serious attention given to what we call ethics and politics. However, it is to say that prior to Socrates these things were not yet objects of philosophy, if for no other reason than philosophy itself was yet to fully emerge, and was still focused for the most part on cosmological matters. The inception of political philosophy is itself tied up with the question of the inception of philosophy generally, a topic too large for this present talk, except to say that Socrates was a revolutionary figure in the intellectual development of the Western tradition because he added human things to the objects of philosophical inquiry. He made man himself an object of inquiry. Just as the subject-object relation in grammar, so too here. The subject of inquiry is the inquirer, man. The object is what is inquired about. Cicero refers to the situation before Socrates, where the pre-Socratic thinkers inquired into the heavens, namely non-human things, but Socrates brought down philosophy from the heavens. In other words, man himself becomes an object of inquiry. Man is uniquely the only object of inquiry which is also its subject, that is, both the subject and object of inquiry become one and the same. This is what was missing before Socrates. The content of what we call ethics and politics was traditionally to be found in poetry, and later, in the course of the 5th century BC, through the appearance of a new genre of writing, history, first with Herodotus and his histories of the Persian Wars, and later with Thucydides and his history of the Peloponnesian Wars, a series of internal wars that convulsed the Greek world for 3 decades in the last third of the 5th century BC. We find discussion of ethical and political matters, but not in any kind of methodologically rigorous sense, as we will later find with the philosophers. It was at this time that Socrates was most active, and though this is a topic I would like to deal with separately in the future, this was a period of cultural collapse and moral crisis. The connection between the emergence of political philosophy and this moral crisis is not coincidental. As Eric Voegelin put it, quote, "In an hour of crisis, when the order of a society flounders and disintegrates, the fundamental problems of political existence in history are more apt to come into view than in periods of comparative stability." End quote. But for now, let us note that political philosophy, inclusive of ethics, arises at a time of great moral confusion, the disintegration of old certainties, and the breakdown of established social forms. If Socrates is the founder of political philosophy, and the best source, because most philosophically incisive, for a depiction of the historical Socrates is the early dialogues of Plato, then our textual source for the political thought of Socrates will be found in that group of Plato's writings. Indeed, 2 texts are of particular interest here. The first is the Apology, his defense speech at his trial on the twin charges of corrupting the youth of Athens and introducing strange gods to the city. The second is the Crito, where the dramatic setting, after the guilty verdict and sentence of death, is in the cell where Socrates is being detained. During the night he is visited by an old and very wealthy friend of his, Crito, who explains a plan to effect an escape with political exile arranged abroad. In response to this, Socrates gives a long account of why he cannot do this. For this, he puts a speech into the mouth of the personification of the laws of Athens, which proceeds to explain the nature of law itself, the obligation of citizens to the polity and its laws, the origin of this obligation, and the reasons why Socrates cannot take up Crito's offer of rescue and exile. Now, there are broadly 2 conceptions of what the philosopher ought to be about. The first and most widely endorsed among philosophers since the beginning is that they are single-mindedly driven by a love of knowledge over opinion. Opinion is dependent on variables. Opinion is usually formed on the basis of how things appear, rather than how they really are, and for these reasons opinion can be false. Knowledge, in contrast, is of its nature, let's say normatively speaking, concerned with stable, unchanging, essential things, and is therefore unerring and can be held with the highest degree of certitude. However, it is a feature of the human situation that the distinction between opinion and knowledge is often blurred or even ignored. Socrates' well-known profession of ignorance goes to the heart of this. He claims not to have knowledge, but prizes it above all other goods, and therefore dedicates his life to its pursuit. In the early dialogues, the subject matter of his not knowing is what we would describe as ethical and political issues, or let's just call them broadly human things. Part of his mission involves refuting those around him, for the most part fellow citizens, who claim to have such knowledge, and he does this through the application of the Elenkos. See Part 2 of my Socratic Method series. In light of the distinction between opinion and knowledge, Socrates is in effect showing these interlocutors that, whereas they thought they had knowledge of X, they in fact only have opinions about X. They are, as it were, oblivious to the tenuous nature of their cognitive states. They fail to appreciate the uncertain nature of their beliefs, and to act on one's opinions as if they were more than just opinions. That is, to vest opinions with certitude can have dangerous outcomes. Certitude, properly speaking, belongs exclusively to knowledge, not to opinions. Now, the philosopher will be satisfied by nothing less than the truth about things. For the knowledge of X is also at the same time the truth about X. To be a philosopher is to be acutely aware of this crucial distinction between opinions about X and knowledge of X, and is, like Socrates, to be animated by an unswerving devotion to the pursuit of knowledge. The very word philosopher, in Greek philosophos, implies it. For this word means one who loves or pursues wisdom, meaning knowledge of fundamental things. The philosopher is one who, like Socrates, is acutely aware that he lacks this knowledge, but nevertheless seeks it out. The underlying conception of knowledge here is called in Greek theoria, from which we get the English word theory. This is an interesting word, for it's derived from the Greek word theia, which, depending on where the stress is placed, can mean either goddess or spectacle, hence the word theatre. Theoretical knowledge is akin to a spectacle, and the theoretician akin to the spectator. When we observe a theatrical production, we passively observe but are nevertheless affected by a series of actions and words which are predetermined through the script and stage directions brought to life by actors, and which depict events and characters which unfold before us. We receive what is presented as it is presented. We do not intervene, we do not contribute to the action or words, we simply observe and allow ourselves to be affected. Theoretical knowledge bears a close kinship to this process, whereby the theoretician, just like the theatre-goer, observes and is affected without determining or intervening in the object of observation. The theoretician observes what it is as it is in and of itself. Theoria is the passive beholding of what is, and the philosopher on this view is then primarily a theoretician. The political philosopher, with discovering the truth about the common good and the best regime for its own sake. The objects of theoria here are the general principles, like the good itself, justice, and so on. The political philosopher is therefore not a partisan activist or an ideologue, let alone a founder or ruler of states, but rather one who seeks the truth here concerning the principles of political and ethical things, or the truth about human things. The second conception of the task of the philosopher is exemplified by something Karl Marx said. It is the 11th of the Theses on Feuerbach. Quote, "The philosophers have only interpreted the world in various ways. The point, however, is to change it." End quote. Marx is credited with a theory about class relations based on an observation of material relations in his own time as well as historically. But he clearly rejects the conception of philosophy as a purely theoretical activity. He says that the task of the philosopher is to change the world. However, philosophy is literally the pursuit of wisdom, philia sophia, the love of wisdom, not the possession of it. And in this, Socrates is paradigmatic, with his famous disavowal of knowledge and his endless searching for it. In this case, Marx must be using the word philosopher in some other sense, because to change the world implies that the world can be made better than it is. The only justification for changing something is if it is in a worse condition than it ought to be, and that changing it is indeed possible as well as desirable. This would imply that the one proposing to change it has knowledge of the good, which would be necessary in order to know in the first place that something is worse than it ought to be. Not only that, one would also need to have a knowledge of how to effect such a change, assuming that such a change is even possible. One would need to know exactly how to transform a worse situation into a better one, that is, to make the world better than it is. And all this on the assumption that the world is worse than it ought to be and that it can be made better. Marx would burden the philosopher of the first kind with more than he can bear, for the philosopher is literally on the way to the answers to these questions, and for the most part by way of theoria. Even if the philosopher discovers the truth about such things, that is, he or she successfully transitions from being a not-knower to a knower, from being a philosophos to being a sophos, one who knows, it in no way follows that he or she ought to take steps to bring the world into conformity with this knowledge, that is, to become a philosopher in Marx's sense of the word. For it is not at all clear as to why we should think this is even possible, given that the great majority of humankind are neither philosophers in the first sense or philosophers in Marx's sense. Let us imagine for a moment that there is such a person, a philosopher of Marx's kind, who knows that the world falls short of how it ought to be, and knows how to transform it from the former state to the latter state. The world is still overwhelmingly inhabited by non-philosophers, in both senses, and we have no reason to believe that they are going to turn to this philosopher and charge him with changing the world for the better. However, we do have reason to believe that they would stoutly resist him. The world as it is the cumulative result of the actions of non-philosophers, that is, people who hold and act on opinions about human things, without recognizing that they are only opinions. A great many people are of the opinion that knowledge of such things is impossible, and we are forever confined to the level of opinion. Ironically, they express this opinion as if it were knowledge. We can only ever have opinions about such things, or these things are all entirely subjective, which just so happens to take the form of an objective judgment, that is, they assert something to be the case. Like this, it is the case that all judgments about ethical and political things are only subjective opinions. However, this is contradictory because, A, it is an assertoric judgment about ethical and political things. That is, it asserts something to be objectively the case. And so, B, it denies what it asserts, that we can only have opinions about such things. But here it is asserted that it is the case that we can only have opinions about such things. That is, it is an objective claim. But contradiction notwithstanding, this is the commonly held view of the matter in our own times. I think we can safely say that the great majority are not going to be amenable to the guidance and leadership of Marx's ideal philosopher. They are not going to acknowledge that he has knowledge of these things. They will instead regard what he says as an opinion, just one amongst many other opinions, and see no reason why they should adopt it over their own or somebody else's opinion. This very question is investigated in Plato's Republic, and so even Plato doubted this, that someone who both knew what was wrong with the world and why, and knew the solutions whereby it could be made better and why, simply because they had knowledge of the good, would ever attain to the position of being able to actually carry out such a program. One of the major obstacles to this, but by no means the only one, is that in his Republic, Plato has Socrates tell his interlocutors that the philosopher has a severe aversion to what we now call political activism, and indeed would avoid it assiduously. A regime led by philosophers would be almost impossible to realize, even if it were desirable, because the great majority who are non-philosophers would be opposed to it, and the philosophers themselves would be averse to it. This conundrum dominates the physical centre of Plato's Republic, and it's something I'd like to take up in the future here. Now, despite all this, Socrates clearly attests to the political implications of his philosophical activities in the Apology. He claims that going around refuting his fellow citizens of their conceit of knowledge is not only for their own individual good, but because it serves the common good also. We should also recall that Socrates was being tried on political charges, that is, for corrupting the youth of the city and for introducing new deities. Many have interpreted the trial of Socrates as the trial of philosophy itself, and indeed Socrates himself understands it in this way, at least in part. This would mean that there is something about philosophy that is somehow considered to be socially subversive, or at least disturbing. What could this be? Now, introducing new deities, whatever that might mean, is not in itself a characteristically philosophical act, as anyone could be of the mind to innovate in religious matters. This charge also proved to be incoherent in the way that it was framed. This leaves the charge of corrupting the youth. As it turns out, this concerns the fact that Socrates has many admirers among the young men of the city, and the strong suspicion hung over Socrates that he was teaching them notions that tended to undermine faith in traditional beliefs and institutions. If this were true, it would certainly make plausible the charge of corrupting the youth of the city. It would seem from these considerations about his trial that philosophy does pose some kind of a disturbing and unsettling presence in society. Socrates has gained a reputation for undermining people's confidence in their own convictions in matters bearing on morality, that is to say, on the common good. Socrates would seem to be at odds with the majority on such issues, at least if we are to go on the verdict of the trial. More precisely, a majority seem to find Socrates' activities somehow unacceptable and deserving of punishment. Now, we find hints at what might be underlying this in the Apology itself, something in Socrates' attitude towards the city and its laws. To explore this in greater detail, I'll need to take a look at a well-known apparent contradiction between something Socrates says in the Apology and something else he seems to be saying, or at least agreeing with, in the Crito. In part 2 of this video, I'm going to take up a close analysis of both the Apology and the Crito on this matter. For the moment, if you liked this video, please press the like button. Also, if you'd like to support the channel, please become a subscriber by pressing this subscribe button. And if you want to be kept up to date with new content, press the little notification bell icon.